Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Brunkish, President of Phoenix Holocaust Association. Thank you all for being here today for the keynote speaker of the Murray and Sabina Zemel Educators Conference on the Holocaust and Genocide. A special welcome to those of you who were here all day attending the conference. I hope you found your time well spent. Great. And I'm sincerely interested to hear from the educators as to what additional information or support is needed to help you in your classrooms. I'll be around after the program today, and I hope you'll take a few moments to share your needs with me. For the past 30 plus years, Phoenix Holocaust Association has been involved with an annual conference for teachers focused on the Holocaust. Until this year, the conference was presented by the Bureau of Jewish Education of Greater Phoenix. This is the first year that the conference has moved to ASU, and I personally couldn't be more delighted with the results. It's been an excellent experience working with Professor Jacob Floss and his colleagues at Shippers, which is the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies here at ASU, as well as the leaders from the Jewish Studies program. We're also thankful to Mirabella at ASU for providing the conference with this lovely venue for several of our sessions today. And before I introduce the people who are going to introduce our speaker, I do want to recognize German Ambassador Stefan Schluter, who is here with us today. And I do want to thank all our workshop presenters. I think you will agree that these experts deserve a round of applause.
Thank you. The Murray and Sabina Zemel Educators Conference. Who the heck are they? You know, you see names and you go, just some other names. Well, I am Barry Zemel, my wife Barbara Zemel, and I'm here to give you a little snippet of their life during those times. Even though I know all this by heart, I wrote it down because it's a very short version, and I didn't want to go into the hour-long presentation. It is often thought that a survivor is someone that went through the concentration or work camps. However, there are so many other types of survivors. Those in plain sight, those that were hiding in the woods, those that were hiding in houses, and those that left Europe prior to the roundups. My parents fit into this category. My dad, Murray, was from the small village of Bialsk in northeastern Poland, not far from my mom's village. And as kids, as it happens, when my dad was 14, my mom was 12, they happened to meet for the first time when my mom went to Bialsk to visit cousins. But they would not see each other for another 10 years, but I'm jumping ahead to the end of the story. My dad, with some incredible luck, made his way to America when he was 17 in October 1938, 1 month before Kristallnacht. It turns out that his father, my grandfather, received a visa from his uncle, but he did not want to leave his family, so he transferred it to my father. My dad, upon arriving, learned English, took menial jobs, and during these years never learned the fate of his parents and his 4 siblings. He joined the army and couldn't wait to go back to defeat the Germans. And Ambassador, no offense if I use the word German. Okay. My mom, Sabina, was from the village of Drobnin and had up until 1935 a normal childhood, and then a very challenging teenage years, as you all know. Right after the 1939 invasion in Poland, All the residents of Drobnin were moved to a fenced-in ghetto several villages away. With uncanny insight, my mom and her two friends snuck under the fence and made their way to a friendly farmer's house, where with the help of a local police chief, she received Polish Catholic identification papers. She was able to do this because she had blonde hair, blue eyes, and was exceedingly stunning. And so she easily passed as a Gentile. Within 6 months, the boys in that town were starting to come around to inquire about this 17-year-old girl. Mom had to leave the farmer's house, and she made her way to Königsberg, that time was on the border of Poland and Russia, and took a job as a nanny with a German officer to watch their two kids. After 2 years, when the kids were older, she moved on to become a maid to the highest-ranking officer in Königsberg. These were frightful times. Not only couldn't she inquire about her parents, about her parents and her 7 brothers and sisters, but she had fear of being exposed. Then in January 1945, my mom was 21 years old, waking up on that cold morning. She went down to clean up the cigars, the cognac glasses, papers from the major gathering that was there the night before by the high command of the Germans, and she found nobody was in the house. She didn't understand it. She went next door. Nobody was there either. The Russians were coming in 1 day later, so everybody ran away. What is she going to do? She found some suitcases, filled them up with candelabras, silverware, linens, and started walking to the train to go back to her home. But it was freezing. The suitcases were very heavy, so there she is on the road throwing away all of these goods that she picked up. Mom was free, which is a misnomer, because what is free? Everyone in Europe at that time was trying to make their way back to their towns. She was warned not to stay, and she left. Europe was a shambles with people going in every direction, trying to find out where relatives are. And finally, she made her way down to Germany, to Frankfurt, and she learned that her family, all of them, had perished. After the American liberation in May of '45, my dad received a letter from his cousin in Brooklyn asking him to find her cousin, Sabina. And as it turned out, my dad's uncle was married to my mom's aunt, which they didn't even know. All right, so there's much more to this love story, how they met and all that, but we're going to leave that for next year when you come back. Suffice it to say, my dad re-upped in the Army to be with my mother. They married July 4th, 1946. They honeymooned in Paris, and 9 months later, here I am. Here's Barbara.
To add to my husband's story really quickly, he lived for, he's lived all these years and really didn't know his mom's story. His mom never talked about. Many survivors will tell you their stories. His mom couldn't talk about it. She would start to talk and she would cry. And then one day, about a month before she passed away, 4 years ago, she just sat down and started telling us her story. We were in such shock that we couldn't even take our phones out and record it. And we heard the story from beginning to end. And we were just, it was just unbelievable to us. So we were so grateful that we were able to hear her story in entirety. And we're so thankful. So anyway, now on to our honoree. We are honored to welcome to ASU our keynote speaker for the Murray and Sabina Zemel Education Conference on the Holocaust and Genocide, Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues at the U.S. State Department, Miss Ellen Germain. We do have a few things in common with Miss Germain. Both Barry, Miss Germain, and I were born and raised in New York City. Also, as Barry has mentioned, we have lived through the Holocaust, he having been a second-generation son, and I, after 50 years of marriage, can attest to that as well. but that's as far as the commonality goes. Before becoming a career member of the Senior Foreign Service in 1995, Ms. Germain worked as a computer programmer and then as a science journalist. She speaks Bosnian and Polish, has studied Russian, and thinks she still remembers some French and Hebrew. In Washington, D.C., Ms. Germain has also held positions in the offices of Russian Affairs, Israel-Palestinian Affairs, and Maghreb Affairs. Her other overseas tours were Tel Aviv, London, and Moscow. Ms. Germain has worked as deputy political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, was head of the U.S. Consulate General in Krakow, Poland, directed the Office of Arabian Peninsula Affairs in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, and most recently was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ms. Germain feels that her previous positions has prepared her for her current role as Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues. Since she assumed this role on August 23, 2021, she has prioritized addressing the growing and disturbing problem of Holocaust denial and distortion of HDD, which is the topic of her presentation today. She is working closely with her colleagues at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance on developing resources and recommendations for governments and educators to identify and counter HDD in all forms. It is our distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce Miss Ellen Germain, and will you all join us in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you so much. I've got it. Okay, you can hear me. I can see that by the nodding heads. Excellent. All right, well, thank you so much, Barb and Barry, for that very kind introduction. And thank you for making this conference possible. I also really want to thank Ambassador Ed O'Donnell and Dr. Jacob Flaws for organizing and inviting me here. It's truly an honor for me to be here. But really, I think my deepest thanks go to all of you teachers in the audience. Thank you for all the really tough work that you do every day. I think you don't get enough recognition or thanks in our society. So a big thank you from me for all that you do. So as educators, I know you're not only teaching students subjects like history and English, but you're also teaching them to be responsible citizens. And I think that's where Holocaust education really comes into play and why it's so important. Learning about the Holocaust isn't just learning the history. It's also trying to learn from the Holocaust. What lessons can we draw from studying the Holocaust, and how can we apply those lessons to help prevent other such atrocities in the future? How can teaching about the Holocaust help students learn tolerance and how to make ethical choices? And teachers really are on the front line when it comes to all of these questions. So it's a huge honor for me to be able to talk with you today about those issues, and in particular about the rise in Holocaust distortion and denial and how that feeds in to all of these questions. So it always seems incredible to me that 75 years after the end of World War II and the Holocaust, people still deny and distort the facts of the genocide, which is one of the best documented mass atrocities in history. We have mountains of evidence, extensive survivor testimonies, and eyewitness accounts from those who liberated the concentration and death camps. Yet Holocaust denial and distortion persist, and in fact, you could say that they've gone viral these days with the rise of social media. Modern-day Holocaust denial and distortion have been exacerbated by all of those, the use of all those digital tools, and by the ease with which misinformation and disinformation can be shared and amplified on social media platforms. And so to me, and I think probably to all of us here, it's really shocking. And the Holocaust is fact, the evidence is overwhelming. So, what is this about, and is there anything we can do about it? So, to try to answer those questions, I want to examine the rising threat from Holocaust distortion and denial worldwide, how such activity affects society and individual behavior, and how it can shape the public's understanding of history and people's perception of the gravity and the enormity of the Holocaust. So first off, let's look at some definitions. According to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Holocaust denial seeks to erase the history of the Holocaust. In doing so, it seeks to legitimize Nazism and anti-Semitism. Holocaust distortion, on the other hand, acknowledges aspects of the Holocaust as factual. However, it excuses, minimizes, or misrepresents the Holocaust in a variety of ways and through various media. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA as it's known as, is a group of 35 countries that are dedicated to accurate commemoration and education about the Holocaust. And the United States is a proud member of IHRA, and I first want to acknowledge the excellent work that IHRA has done on these issues, Holocaust distortion and denial. And IHRA provides excellent resources on teaching the Holocaust and on learning about the Holocaust. And I've actually brought some copies of these recommendations for all of you. They are right outside, so please feel free to pick up one of those booklets. And I definitely recommend that everybody take a look at the IHRA's website, holocaustremembrance.com. They've got a lot of good resources on defining and countering anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial and distortion, anti-Gypsy, anti-Roma discrimination, and more. So, Holocaust denial. And this is just a picture of a gathering in Iran in 2006, where Holocaust denial, unfortunately, is quite rampant. Although Holocaust education and commemoration have really increased tremendously, denial and distortion have also become much more widespread, particularly as tools for extremists. And I'm going to talk about some examples of Holocaust denial and distortion, and then talk about the importance of upholding freedom of expression while still trying to counter Holocaust denial and distortion, because there is an obvious tension between those two goals. So, Holocaust denial really has a long history, starting with the Nazis themselves, who used all kinds of euphemisms to describe their systematic murder of Europe's Jews. And an anecdote to kind of start off with, I was in Malmö, Sweden in last October for the International Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. And during the opening session there, Holocaust survivor Tobias Ravet talked about how hearing a Holocaust denier had made him realize that he had to bear witness to what had happened. He said that when he was 56, he heard a Holocaust denier on television, and it felt as if that person was saying that Mr. Ravet's life was a lie, as if his cousins and other family members had never lived and had never been murdered during the Holocaust. So he decided that he had to start speaking up about his experiences and sharing his experience of the Holocaust. He was born in Poland, Mr. Ravet was taken to the Łódź ghetto with his parents when he was 3 years old. He was hidden in an attic for 49 days when he was 8, and then deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Miraculously, he and his parents survived, but most of his extended family was murdered. Mr. Ravet's story of why he decided to bear public witness to the Holocaust was incredibly moving, and it showed all of us in the audience at that time how Holocaust denial tries to erase the suffering of Holocaust survivors and tries to wipe out the historical reality of the murder of 6 million Jews by Nazis and their collaborators. And Professor Deborah Lipstadt, who is an eminent historian of the Holocaust and is now my colleague at the US Department of State as the Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, said it very clearly. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. For Holocaust deniers to be right, all survivors would have to be wrong. Holocaust distortion, on the other hand, is a more recent threat, especially in our social media age, which makes it much easier to share and disseminate distortion and denial. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum did a study last year called Holocaust Memory at Risk, which was focused on distortion of Holocaust history throughout Europe. And the study noted that Europe sets the tone for how the Holocaust is remembered everywhere, and that accurate Holocaust history is being challenged across the continent as Holocaust survivors are dwindling in number, and despite extensive commitments by many European governments to education and commemoration of the Holocaust. The distortion is also fed by rising nationalism and xenophobia in some countries. So one example of Holocaust distortion is the rehabilitation of people who played roles in committing the crimes of the Holocaust. Some, like Jonas Noreika in Lithuania and Stepan Bandera in Ukraine, are considered national heroes because they fought against Soviet tyranny, but they also collaborated with the Nazis. Croatia still has streets named after officials of the Nazi-allied Ustasha regime, which killed tens of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Some countries have named sports stadiums after collaborators. And others downplay or ignore the role of local collaborators in helping to perpetrate the Holocaust, as those countries try to develop a heroic narrative of their national history. But all countries, including the United States, have to face up to the reality of their history, both the good and the bad. Indeed, the United States took steps that made it much more difficult for refugees trying to flee Nazi Europe to enter the United States. So there are also instances of governments manipulating and distorting World War II and Holocaust history to further their own geopolitical designs. And one of the obvious examples of this is the current Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. One of Russia's most common disinformation narratives is to justify its devastating war against Ukraine by saying that Russia is pursuing the denazification of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin has referred to Ukraine's democratically elected government as, quote, a gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis, unquote, while Russian state media and propagandists have repeatedly called for the denazification of the entire population of Ukraine. By evoking Nazism and the horrors associated with World War II and the Holocaust, the Kremlin hopes to delegitimize and demonize Ukraine in the eyes of the Russian public and indeed the eyes of the world. The Kremlin attempts to manipulate international public opinion by drawing false parallels between Moscow's aggression against Ukraine and the Soviet fight against Nazi Germany. This disinformation campaign is also detracting from critically important global efforts to combat anti-Semitism and is instead propagating one of anti-Semitism's most insidious forms, Holocaust Distortion. Another example of Holocaust distortion is the use of Holocaust imagery or language for political or ideological reasons. This can trivialize and demean the Holocaust. A recent example is the use of yellow stars worn by anti-COVID, anti-vax protesters in the United States and in Europe. The Nazis, of course, forced Jews to wear yellow stars of David on their clothing so that the Jews could be easily identified in order to harass and isolate Jews, force them into ghettos, round them up, deport them, and eventually murder them. And it's crazy to have to say this, but that's not comparable to the inconvenience of not being allowed to enter a restaurant because you chose not to be vaccinated. Some politicians in the United States and in Europe have compared COVID-19 restrictions to the persecutions suffered by Jews during the Holocaust. These are false comparisons that distort the Holocaust's significance as a uniquely horrific effort to systematically annihilate an entire people. They harm our democratic institutions by comparing measures that were taken to protect public health and to save lives to measures taken by the Nazis to cold-bloodedly target and callously murder 6 million Jews. Holocaust distortion can also involve minimizing the impact of the Holocaust or claiming that fewer people were killed than has been established by overwhelming evidence. Holocaust distortion is also present in statements that the Nazis were justified in their pursuit of the final solution, to kill all Jews. Holocaust distortion is a form of anti-Semitism, and it feeds more anti-Semitism. And of course, the Holocaust is the most horrifying example of the destruction and death to which unchecked hatred can lead. And all this matters because all efforts to downplay or blur the facts of what happened and who was complicit in the Holocaust are insults to its victims and to the survivors. It also further perpetuates anti-Semitism, targeting Jews living today in various societies around the world. It's important to counter Holocaust denial and distortion because they threaten our ability to understand and to learn from the history of the Holocaust. We often say that we must teach about the Holocaust in order to learn from it so that such depravity is never permitted to happen again. Never again is one of the most important lessons that we draw from the Holocaust. However, the world has been far from perfect in applying that lesson, and mass atrocities throughout the world, such as the genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Darfur, and Xinjiang, show that very clearly. But I would say we are trying to do better by bringing a measure of justice through a range of efforts to support specialized national and international investigations and regional courts, war crimes units, and international investigative mechanisms and courts. And these include things like the International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, and a whole range of legal mechanisms to document and pursue accountability for potential war crimes or other atrocities right now going on in Ukraine. Our efforts to deter and prevent atrocities also include peacekeeping operations, and very importantly, of course, education. The United States, for example, supports programs to train teachers to teach about the Holocaust and exchange programs for teachers, civil society, law enforcement, and others from foreign countries who come from overseas to learn about confronting anti-Semitism and confronting Holocaust distortion and denial, just to name a few of the kinds of exchange programs that the State Department runs. So education means not only teaching the facts of the Holocaust, as I said earlier, but also teaching about tolerance and inclusivity so that maybe in the future people will be less inclined to discriminate against those who are different from them, or to harm or even kill those who come from different cultures, different religions, or different parts of society. And that kind of education has been shown to have positive associations. The Anti-Defamation League, the University of Southern California's Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem did a survey in 2020 of American university students. The survey looked at the relationship between Holocaust education and students' behavior and attitudes. Students who had received Holocaust education in their high school classes not only did better in their historical knowledge of the Holocaust, they also had more pluralistic attitudes and were more open to differing viewpoints. They were also more willing to challenge intolerant behavior in other people. So correlation is not cause and effect, of course, but the survey results at least offer some hope that teaching about the Holocaust can have positive, tangible effects on people's behavior in the real world. And as I alluded to a little earlier, one of the challenges to countering Holocaust denial and distortion is that those efforts inevitably get caught up in discussions about freedom of expression. Many European countries have laws criminalizing Holocaust denial and promotion of Nazi ideology. The United States, on the other hand, does not criminalize hate speech of any kind, including Holocaust distortion or denial and promotion of Nazi ideology, as odious as it is. In fact, as we all know, and sorry, I can't center that, but we all know the First Amendment, which broadly protects speech. Are we able? Okay, thank you, Jacob. First Amendment broadly protects speech, including offensive speech, from government interference or regulation. And as we all know, this is what it says. So, in a seminal court case, which many of you may be familiar with, that tested the limits of free speech under the First Amendment, a group of neo-Nazis tried to get a permit from municipal authorities to demonstrate in downtown Skokie, a suburb of Chicago, that was nearly half Jewish and was home to hundreds of Holocaust survivors. The neo-Nazi demonstration was going to consist of 25 to 50 party members dressed in Nazi uniforms with swastika armbands carrying Nazi banners. And this was in the 1970s. And the attorney who represented the neo-Nazis, who was himself Jewish, saw the issue as clear-cut, because if the government can prevent lawful speech because it is offensive and hateful, then it can prevent any speech that it dislikes. And in the end, although the courts did ultimately rule that the neo-Nazis had the right to peaceful assembly, the demonstration took place in downtown Chicago rather than in the town of Skokie. So this was a very controversial case, and it illustrates quite clearly that here in the United States, abhorrent and hateful speech is protected, no matter how awful it is. And indeed, here for us in the US, in our tradition, the answer to bad speech, including racist, anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying and distorting speech, is not government intervention or censorship. It's more speech, speech that promotes tolerance, counters lies with facts, and pushes back on that intolerant, hateful speech. So in the US, in our system, the evolution of the free speech doctrine has meant that content-based restrictions are very strictly scrutinized and are rarely approved. But today, as we're all aware, there are a lot of questions about the regulation of speech being raised with regard, in particular, to social media platforms. And the internet and social media platforms are now the subject of intensive debate about regulation of content. As a general matter, US law does not regulate user content online because that's protected under the First Amendment. The removal of third-party content that does not violate US federal criminal law is at the discretion of internet and social media providers. Those entities may, and sometimes do, voluntarily choose to remove websites or social media content or accounts that have content that violates those services' own terms of service agreements. What that means is that social media platforms in the United States are not liable for content posted by third parties. So, we can ask, and we are asking now, should social media companies be responsible for the information that people post on their sites? Or maybe the question is, should those companies be held responsible for the results of the manipulative algorithms that incite hatred and violence and perhaps even genocide, algorithms that sometimes prioritize or highlight posts that are very emotional, which are sadly often the posts that arouse the negative emotions? And should companies be regulated in their ability to implement algorithms like that? And governments, including the current Biden-Harris administration, are really still trying to figure out how to deal with these issues. And, what are the answers to these very thorny questions while still respecting and protecting freedom of expression? So it's also up to all of us as teachers, as parents, as responsible citizens, to think before we post and to think before we respond in, inflammatory ways on social media, and also to help teach children learn to think critically, to evaluate the reliability of sources, and, to think about what they're going to post, to count to 10 before they respond, before any of us respond to inflammatory postings. So in the meantime, as we struggle with all of these questions and struggle with educating ourselves and others about them and about how to respond to and on social media, some social media platforms have taken some steps and some actions against Holocaust distortion and denial online. In late 2020, for example, Facebook finally agreed to take down posts that deny or distort the Holocaust and to direct users to more authoritative sources when they search for information. And I actually tested that out myself on Facebook by searching for some of the key words that Holocaust deniers use. They use holohoax or Holocaust hoax. And when I searched for those terms on Facebook, indeed, I was directed to reliable sources like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum or the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And so Twitter followed Facebook's leads and banned Holocaust denial posts as well. But everybody acknowledges that this is something that is very, very hard to do. It's really difficult to find and remove all instances of Holocaust denial and distortion, and it is like whack-a-mole. You remove one site or one post, and others spring up almost immediately. So an Anti-Defamation League report from December of last year found that while major Holocaust denial groups had been removed from Facebook, many Holocaust denial and distortion posts remained accessible. And these are obviously issues that are going to be with us for a very long time. So I don't want to leave this issue really without acknowledging that online platforms can also be powerful platforms for spreading the truth. They can pose a challenge to authoritarian regimes and can help amplify voices of peaceful dissent. So, for example, Russia fined Google $100 million for, quote, systematic failure to remove banned content. And that banned content included posts that were related to peaceful political opposition in Russia. The People's Republic of China has very sophisticated controls that block websites and censor content, including content about the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang. And so while internet and social media sites help spread Holocaust denial and distortion, they can also make it easier to publicly spread accessible, accurate, and make accessible, accurate information about the Holocaust, and to disseminate important information about serious violations of human rights in today's world. And there is #ProtectTheFacts, which is a social media campaign to support the accurate commemoration and history about the Holocaust. And I encourage you all to take a look at it or use that hashtag if you're on Twitter and posting factual information or trying to push back against deniers. So Holocaust denial and distortion not only deny and distort historical facts, they're antithetical to our democratic values. Accurate historical education and truthful commemoration of the Holocaust teach new generations about our past and the horrors to which unbridled hate can lead. As a recent U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum report put it, the collective memory of 2 world wars and the Holocaust played a key role in the creation of global, transatlantic, and European institutions designed to protect peace, security, and human dignity. Holocaust distortion and related misuses of history for political purposes inevitably undermine the justification and the defense of these institutions and the principles on which they are based. So in the end, really, what can we all do about this? Well, those of you who are teachers are really in a unique position to teach the accurate and truthful history of the horrors of the Holocaust. You can educate your students to identify Holocaust denial and distortion and to counter it with facts. And all of us can and must do everything we can every day to counter Holocaust denial and distortion and other modern manifestations of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. We must highlight the painful and important lessons of the Holocaust, including the importance of respecting human rights and dignity of people who are different from us, because that is really the only way that we can even start to fulfill that solemn pledge of never again. Thank you all very much. And I am happy to take questions, comments. Jacob, I don't know what the plan is.
Thank you very much. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes if
Okay.
you would like to take some questions.
Yeah.
So I will try to run the mic around as best I can. So
Okay.
if you have a question, keep that hand raised high.
Do you think that the Alex Jones verdict will have any impact on the kind of, legislative or criminal or judicial, punishments for people who basically promote lies through their own social media?
I would almost say, I would turn the question around a little bit and say, I don't know that it will have influence on the legislative issues because we don't legislate free speech here. But it was clear that the juries in the Alex Jones cases felt really strongly about it and thought he had done, he deserved to be fined huge sums of money and bankrupted. I hope that has an effect on others who are posting hateful information like that. I don't know if, like all of us, I don't know if it will. But it was certainly, I think in a lot of ways, a watershed, seeing that verdict, the jury decision come down.
Is there any expectation of an onslaught of, when our last survivors are gone, is there any expectation of a problem at that time? And are we doing anything proactive to have sort of a strong front, whether it's by the second generation? Are we preparing
Yeah.
for that time outside of all the regular things we're doing?
Absolutely. And there are about 250 to 300,000 survivors still living today, all basically in their 80s and 90s. And 5 years from now, that number will probably be half of that. So inevitably, survivors are diminishing in number, and research shows that one of the best ways to educate about the Holocaust and to get people to understand, students to understand it, or really anyone, is for them to speak directly to a Holocaust survivor, to hear from survivors their stories. So, yeah, what happens when there are no more survivors who can directly talk about their experiences? Well, as you all know, a lot of archives that have videos of survivors' stories, survivor testimony. Shoah Foundation, the Holocaust Museum, Holocaust museums around the country and indeed around the world have those. There's also some really interesting work on 3D holograms. Right, I see some of you nodding, you've seen that, where the Shoah Foundation is working on this, where they essentially have a survivor answer hours and hours of questions, and then they make a hologram, which is a 3D virtual, picture of the person, and you have that hologram sitting up on stage, like, if I'm a hologram, and you can ask questions of me I'm a survivor. You can ask questions, and the hologram will answer it because it has programmed into it so many answers on to so many of the questions that people ask of survivors. And they've tested this out on student groups already, and it gets amazing results. I mean, the students find it a very powerful experience. So those are some ideas, and definitely second and third generation, what they're called second and third generation survivors, so children, grandchildren of survivors, are also taking up the burden, the responsibility of telling their stories as children and grandchildren of survivors, how that affected them, and of telling their parents' or grandparents' stories. Indeed, as Barry just told the story of his parents.
I just want to let you know, we have a hologram coming here.
Wow, great. It is.
The Arizona Jewish
Okay.
Society,
Uh-huh.
by Oscar Knobloch, a survivor who's still around.
Yeah.
And next week for opening of the exhibit, he's going to be asking himself the questions.
Wow. Wow.
The exhibit opens on November 9th at the Arizona Jewish Historical Society. We've just gotten the hologram. We're beta testing it now. He can answer 1,000 questions.
Incredible. God, I will have to come back and see that. It's really amazing the things we can do. So yes, there are definitely I think all the Holocaust museums and organizations are thinking about future and how can we continue to commemorate and educate about the Holocaust.
Thank you for this. I wanted to mention something else too. I don't know how many of you all here are Librans, but we tend to like the other side as well. When you're talking about, it seems to me, and I hope you agree, for example, if you look at a movie like Denial about the Lipstadt-Irving trial, as a useless PhD holder of cinema, I can tell you it's a crappy movie, but I loved it. But the point is that you then, but then take that extra step. You look at Lipstadt's work. How did it really come down in the trial? What was being denied exactly? But I also would suggest, as you look at the transcripts, which I've been doing, of the hundreds and hundreds of both mind-numbingly boring stuff from David Irving, but is letting me know, why does Irving say what he does? What is hard to deny? What isn't hard to deny? If he sees, look, there aren't even 4 holes where there were, gas chambers and all that. Find out what was found out afterwards. What else does he believe? What do Holocaust deniers actually believe? As far as I can tell, and I've lived in Britain for almost about half my life, most of them who showed up at that trial didn't know a damn thing about it. But a lot of the other deniers think they know something about it. Learn the other side and learn what deniers are saying so you know exactly what you can counter with. Because it's one thing to counter with emotion, it's another thing to counter with pure facts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard, it can be hard to force yourself, as I'm sure you know, to go into that sinkhole of hate and racism and anti-Semitism. But sometimes it's necessary indeed so that you can understand what the haters and the deniers are saying and are able to come out. And that is what Protect the Facts is about. How do you counter? When people say, well, this small detail is wrong. Well, one mistake in a small detail does not invalidate the truthfulness of the Holocaust.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So, Kim.
Well, this kind of goes along with what was just said, but I'm glad that you pointed out that global perspective. You've worked in Bosnia, and the denial there, like in the Republic of Srpska, where you can't use the word genocide to talk about what happened there, and like you were saying, the monuments to people who are criminals, who have committed murder. And so what can we learn from those examples, or can we? Are we too far gone in our own distortion and denial here? But what lessons could be learned on that global level?
Yeah, well, again, I would say, we're struggling with that in our own ways here in the United States. Not only World War II, and I'll give an example of that in a moment, but now with all the conversations around the history of slavery in this country and the questions about what do you do about statues of Confederate generals, people who are viewed as heroes by some, but as perpetrators and supporters of slavery, and how we in the United States are only now starting to confront the horrible history of slavery and racism in this country. And that doesn't make us evil people. It just makes us human. And as I say when I talk to foreign audiences, the thing that I am proud of, one of the many things I'm proud of as an American, is that we question and we criticize ourselves and we try to do better. It takes us a long time sometimes, and we don't do it perfectly, but there is a difference between the Western style, countries, the democracies of the world that protect free speech and try to criticize themselves when they do wrong, as all people and countries inevitably do, and countries that suppress and refuse to face the bad as well as the good in their history. And so just a World War II rehabilitation example from the United States is Wernher von Braun, who is the father of rocket science. He developed the German V2 rockets and was a devoted Nazi and quite high level. And the United States brought him over here along with other scientists after World War II, ignoring his collaboration, his complicity, because we wanted him to help jumpstart our missile and space program. And until just a couple of years ago, there was a bust of Wernher von Braun at NASA headquarters, right in the center, I think the center courtyard. And the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, with the support of my office, worked very hard to educate NASA officials about why they should not have a bust of Wernher von Braun at NASA headquarters, despite the fact that, yes, he was a brilliant scientist and he was also, an active high-level Nazi. And, maybe the one does not, being a brilliant scientist does not necessarily outweigh the other.
All right, we have time for one more question, so no pressure.
This may seem a stupid question, and your
No
first
stupid
response,
questions.
yeah, that's what I always say too. No stupid questions. And your first response may be, were you listening? Isn't it self-evident? But I would like, as a takeaway, to hear you articulate why denying the Holocaust encourages anti-Semitism.
Denying it's hard, I would say, we're all into 10-second sound bites, and this is not necessarily a question that can be answered, and it's definitely not a stupid question, because this goes to the question of how do you answer Holocaust deniers at all? Well, they'll say, this is not anti-Semitism, I'm just talking about historical truth. They're not, of course, but you have to be able to respond to this. So the Holocaust was an effort to systematically annihilate an entire people. An entire culture and community was annihilated from Europe, Eastern Europe in particular. There are only tiny Jewish communities left in those countries, and that whole culture and way of life is no more, all gone. The Nazis had a very clear racial hierarchy that put Jews at the bottom, also Roma, LGBTQI persons, people with disabilities, Slavs were there along on the subhuman race. But there was a racial hierarchy there that these are not human beings. These are not people who are worthy of being treated the same way we would treat Aryan Germans. Anti-Semitism is a perception, a way of viewing and treating Jews as different from others, of whether it is blaming them for, blaming the Jewish, communal Jewish, I don't know what the Jewish community as a whole for actions of an individual Jew, for saying, stereotypes that, saying anti-Semitism includes saying stereotypes are true. And that was part of the Nazi ideology, that Jews are a certain way. So to deny the Holocaust is to deny that this ultimate, as I said in my talk, this ultimate end to which hate and anti-Semitism leads is murder, the murder of an entire people, entire communities in Europe. So Holocaust denial, denies that there was an attitude and a treatment of the Jews in Europe in a way that basically dehumanized them and treated them as something other. And that is why to deny the Holocaust is essentially to deny that anti-Semitism existed at that time and still does. And I hope we all know and acknowledge that indeed it does still exist and is something that we have to fight against in all its forms, including Holocaust denial and distortion. So not a stupid question at all, a very important and fundamental one.
Well, I want to go ahead and wrap up, and from all of us, thank you so much for coming out and speaking to us. The U.S. Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues from the U.S. State Department, Ellen Germain, if you'd please join me in giving her a round of applause.
Thank you.